but it's one that I think is useful because of its downstream effects being detoxification and energy production.
You're listening to the Ethos Athletes Podcast, where we believe that your health is the number one resource you need to accomplish your dreams. My name is Dr. Matthew Hernandez, and I'm a physician dedicated to helping my patients maintain their active lifestyle and continue doing what they love. I'm sitting down with other experts so that we can provide our listeners with the knowledge they need to improve their health and live their best life. Hey everyone, this is Dr. Matthew Hernandez, and you're listening to the Ethos Athletes Podcast. And today we're going to be completing our series on secrets to performance optimization with Dr. Warren Brown, who is the owner of Clinical Advances for Sport. So Dr. Brown, welcome back to the show.
Great to be back, Dr. Matt. Always a pleasure to speak with you.
As I mentioned, we are on the final episode of this particular series. It's been quite a journey. We've learned a number of different things with regards to performance optimization and some things that you can be doing to actually go and increase not only your performance, but your overall health. So just to kind of recap on some of the things we've touched on, in episode 1, we talked about gut function, how leaky gut can impact your health and performance. The second episode, we talked about energy production. And then we also talked about hormone balancing, detoxification and oxidative stress, immune response. And then today we're going to be talking about structural integrity. And there's 2 aspects to this. And so we'll start with this first aspect of structural integrity, where Dr. Warren has, in the previous episodes, essentially talked about the microstructures of the body and genomics with regards to structural integrity. So can you tell us a little bit about, genetics is a very complex topic. So how do you approach this topic with athletes and looking to enhance their performance?
Looking at their genomics allows me to see basically a blueprint, or maybe a better analogy is sort of a recipe for what's going on in their body. These our genomics tell us about how we are making. They give us the instructions of how we are making structural proteins in the body, and based on our genetic blueprint or recipe, we can kind of see. We can get some insight into that. So if we look at genetic mutations, or as they're often called, single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, then we can get some information about what kind of structural protein are they making, how that impacts their biochemical pathways, and in a lot of cases we can't change the gene, but we can change the expression of that gene through things like diet and lifestyle, et cetera. So, I mentioned just a second ago, a blueprint or a recipe. A recipe probably is a better analogy to make.
Yeah, I like that. I like that analogy.
Blueprints are generally followed a little more exactly, but recipes, I like that example because, and I didn't make this up, I learned this somewhere along the way, but it leaves a little bit more room for uncertainty. So like when you're essentially baking some cookies, even though you follow that recipe exactly, you're not going to get 2 cookies that are exactly the same. So there's just too many X factors that influence that recipe. How much you stir the batter, subtle differences in humidity or temperature, time, etc. So I think the recipe analogy is a better one than a blueprint, but that sort of tells us, these, even though we've got these instructions, they're not always set in stone in terms of how that shows up in the body. So it's a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole puzzle.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And we talk about, you mentioned the term gene expression, and we've learned about different aspects in medicine where you can have specific genes that can either get essentially get turned on or off depending on environmental factors, diet, exercise, all these different things. And so a lot of these SNPs and genes are essentially switches, and so they can be turned on or off depending on how good or bad your habits are, different things like that. So recipe honestly does make the most sense for an analogy, just because of the different variables that you can have with the different outside factors that can impact all this.
Yeah, and there's this mantra in genomics, at least from a functional medicine perspective, that genes aren't necessarily our destiny.
Right.
That there are things that we can do to sort of modify the expression of those genes. The gene itself won't change, but the expression of the gene will potentially. So I like that. I think it's really, we sit at the intersection of our genetics and our environment. We're sort of right in between in that Venn diagram, so to speak. We're right in the middle there. So that's there is influence from genes. There's also influence from environment. And it's really when those both come together, that's where we are.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I like that a lot. So then when we're looking at, we've talked about genes and SNPs. Which ones are you looking at with regards to performance and optimization?
Yeah, there's a lot of genetic information in our bodies. The average person has about 3 million SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. So basically that's just what's called a point mutation, where we code in a particular amino acid in place of another one. In the simplest terms I can make it, but basically SNPs are pretty common. They happen about every 1,000 nucleotides. Nucleotides are just the basic structural unit of DNA. And the average person has about 3 million of those. So that's a lot of potential SNPs.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're not looking at all of those. But we can focus on the ones that are relevant, meaning they have some impact, some known impact in our biochemistry or physiology, because some of them do not, or at least not that we know at this point. We also look at ones that are prevalent, so ones that exist in a significant percentage of the population. So some of these genes are some of these SNPs are extremely rare, so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to test everybody for the very rare ones. The ones that are modifiable through diet, nutrition, lifestyle, supplements, things like that, modifiable in terms of their effects, of course, and ones that we can measure, ones that are technically viable, ones that we can measure through laboratory testing. So that's the overall premise of the ones that I'm looking at, and I look at. There's a lot of them that I think have relevance for athletes, like COMT, MTHFR, TNF alpha, the cytochrome enzymes. So there are a lot that can be helpful to look at, but just sort of unpacking that a little bit, I think one of the ones that a lot of people know about already to some degree is MTHFR. And that's basically a SNP that fits all that criteria that I just mentioned about being prevalent and relevant and et cetera. This is one that's pretty common, and it's one that we know a lot about. There's over 50,000 articles on PubMed about MTHFR. And so this one is basically a methylation SNP. And methylation is important for so many different processes in the body, but especially creatine production. And that has a particular importance to muscle function. So MTHFR is one that we should care about for a number of different reasons. But it's basically an enzyme. There's 2 locations we look at the MTHFR enzyme, and the 677 location, the 1298 location. And if there's a SNP, if there's a mutation at either or both of those locations, and if it's a compound SNP, then that could mean that enzyme works upwards of 70% less efficiently than somebody who does not have that SNP. And so that could have an impact in, as we mentioned, muscle function, homocysteine levels, ability to methylate. It's been associated with mood issues and cardiovascular health. So there's a lot we know about that enzyme, and it has relevance not only for athletes, but I would say even most patients that walk into our practices.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the specific connection between creatine and muscle function. Can you talk a little bit about how creatine production affects muscle function, and then what missing or having an MTHFR genetic step that causes an issue can, how that can impact it all?
Yeah,
Just to give an
yeah.
example of how what we're looking for when we're evaluating these different SNPs can be like how we can apply the information that we gain from that.
hmm So MTHFR, the connection there is that it's a key player in methylation in the methylation cycle, which is basically converting homocysteine to methionine in a circle. And there's a lot of intermediates in between there, but that is the body's always doing this for the purposes of generating methyl groups. Methyl groups are kind of like basically methyl groups are a biochemical group of atoms that we add on to substrates to change them, and that alters function. And this is something that happens in biochemistry in our bodies billions of times every second. So methylation, even though it's a simple process, the fact that it happens so often and touches so many different processes makes it that much more important. Specifically regarding muscle function, we need methylation to convert glycine, arginine, and SAM, acetinosyl methionine, a form of methionine. We need methylation to happen to basically take those amino acids. Glycine is an amino acid, arginine is an amino acid, and SAM is an amino acid in order to make creatine. So a lot of people who in the athletic field who take creatine are doing so hoping to get that benefit to muscle function. But if we see that they have an MTHFR SNP at either or both locations of the gene, then that can sort of tell us something. That this patient might not be making, might have a harder time making creatine, things like that. And MTHFR is something we can address clinically. What tends to one of the reasons why we give folate, methylated folate, is because MTHFR is an enzyme that takes tetrahydrofolate and converts it into this 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate form that we need to participate in that methylation cycle. So MTHFR essentially is, if we give methylated folate, we're sort of bypassing the issue. But it does even get a little more complicated than that. So there's a number of other B vitamins and minerals involved as well. So but this is one of the reasons why MTHFR is one of the reasons why methylfolate has become so popular.
Like you said, there's been a lot of research and connections with MTHFR and how having an issue with this particular gene and methylation can lead to so many different things. Kind of has that widespread effect that the oxidative stress in one of the previous episodes that we talked about as well, how there's so many different connections to it. And so, being able
Right.
to check for that is going to be important, and just allowing us to improve someone's health, and then also them being able to improve performance at the end of the day as well.
Mm-hmm.
You've mentioned, okay, so you touched a little bit on MTHFR. Can you talk a little bit about COMT? I know we've also talked about this in the past as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about this particular SNP and what you're looking for with regards to it?
This is another one involved in methylation. With COMT, in my mind, it's more of a detoxification type of methylation, whereas MTHFR is a little bit more of a cardiovascular type of methylation. And that's probably an oversimplification, but it works clinically because COMT is basically involved in the detoxification of catecholamines like epi and norepi, dopamine, estrogens, and environmental toxins. So this is another SNP that I check pretty often because it's involved in methylation, but also because it's involved in detoxification and its influence there. It's part of phase 2 of liver detoxification. And just sort of recapping that, or introducing it in the first place. Rather, I don't think we talked about that one yet. But phase 1 and phase 2 of liver detoxification is basically a huge amount of the detox capacity in the body. The liver is just an incredibly important organ in terms of detoxification. And it happens in phases. The first phase, we take a substance, we convert it a little bit, we create an intermediate that then has to be taken through a second phase. And COMT plays a huge role in the second phase. It is a methyltransferase, just like MTHFR, but this is attaching a methyl group onto something to try and get rid of it. One of those examples, I think, that's maybe a little easier to understand, or at least in my mind, is when we methylate epinephrine and norepinephrine. If we have a COMT SNP, that process isn't happening as well, likely. So we tend to build up epinephrine and norepinephrine. And that's why a lot of people with COMT, SNPs for COMT, are more prone to things like anxiety or mood issues. They feel amped up. They might feel more stressed. And so it's COMT that we have to thank for metabolizing those catecholamines. And if they've built up, we're going to feel more amped, more stressed, possibly more anxious, things like that. So that's I think that's it has its detriments, which could be mood issues. It also has its benefits because it gives us a really good ability to focus. It's almost like giving us that tunnel vision. If we've got epinephrine and norepinephrine, that's the fight or flight response, and usually that is a sort of a tunnel vision. We're focused on a task, and we're going to execute that task. So this is one of the benefits of it, and why not all SNPs are good or bad.
Right.
Oh, one other thing I was going to mention is if we're having problems with anxiety or panic or just lots of stress, then having this information, do we have a COMT SNP that we need to work around? Do we need to support that patient with more B vitamins, dark leafy greens in the diet, things like that? Those are some of the things to think about if we've got that SNP.
Yeah, it's good to know. I actually wasn't aware of that connection with COMT, and then it's the SNP basically going and increasing epinephrine and norepinephrine and causing anxiety and stuff. So that's actually good to know. I wasn't aware of that connection. So
I told my wife about this SNP, and I said, this is why, because I'm homozygous for this, so I have both of my copies of the gene. One comes from mother, one comes from father. Both of them have the SNP. That means I have this ability to focus, but it doesn't make me a good multitasker. And she said, "Oh yeah, that totally makes sense."
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, no, I wasn't aware of that connection. I'll have to go check my results on that too then. Can you speak a little bit more about, so MTHFR and COMT have to do with methylation, and they have a tie to methylation. Can you tell me a little bit more about TNF alpha?
Yeah, TNF alpha is a pro-inflammatory cytokine. And if we have a SNP for TNF alpha, unlike COMT and MTHFR, where those enzymes aren't functioning as well, they're not built in a way that gives them optimal function. TNF alpha, if it's not built properly, or if it has a SNP, you could think of it like that, that enzyme runs a pathway that is functioning faster. So if it's a pro-inflammatory cytokine, then it's making more pro-inflammatory cytokines. And because of that, it has associations with autoimmune conditions, higher levels of oxidative stress, which we talked about in an earlier episode. But TNF alpha SNPs are fairly common, and that's one of the things I check for, because that can give me a little bit more insight into the redox balance, the oxidative stress issue we were talking about earlier in the detox module.
Awesome, perfect. You said that there's connections to autoimmunity, and then just more inflammation in general if someone has a SNP in this issue in this particular one.
Right. Yeah.
A mutation in the
TNF alpha. It's if we're seeing SNPs in that, then we would think about that, the possibility of more oxidative stress. And if we're seeing that as well, then we think about antioxidant support in that person.
Okay. So from an athlete perspective, where they're more prone to oxidative stress, and if they have already, just based on the activity level, having this TNF alpha SNP will push that oxidative stress even further, correct?
Yeah, that's the idea. And oxidative stress we touched on earlier, that's a huge potential issue for endurance athletes, but there's even some data that mentions that even resistance training can create oxidative stress. So it's not just the ultramarathoners and marathoners, it's people who are doing more shorter activities, but doing involved in a lot of resistance training as well. So I think that's one thing that makes it useful to look at, not just in the endurance patients, but also in patients who are just active with in shorter duration exercises.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And then you also talked about cytochrome. So I'm assuming this has to do with energy production.
The CBS enzyme.
Yeah.
Yeah. CBS cystathionine beta synthase. This is basically, it's connected to the methylation pathway, and it's sort of a transition point between methylation and detoxification and energy production.
Okay.
So this one is kind of at an intersection between a few different important processes in the body. And this one, kind of like TNF alpha, if we've got a SNP here, it's upregulated. So it actually results in more activity, sometimes lower homocysteine levels. But it's one that I think is useful because of its downstream effects being detoxification and energy production. Some people call that CBS enzyme the open drain, meaning that it sort of drains the methylation cycle. So if you've got a SNP there, really the effects are going to be could be potentially methylation issues. So that's why I think it's useful to look at.
Okay.
It's I think it's a fairly common SNP, but I look at it in the context of methylation, detoxification, and energy production, really kind of sitting in between all of those.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Outside of those four, are there any others that you tend to look at in general for people's health and performance?
Vitamin D receptor is one that I think is worth looking at, particularly because vitamin D touches on so many different aspects of our physiology and biochemistry, so function, immune response. So vitamin D receptor can, if we have a SNP there, it might be harder for us to maintain adequate vitamin D levels. So sometimes that can explain why we might be seeing issues with vitamin D in somebody who's taking it and not really getting the benefit from it.
Okay.
And I do look at there are a lot of cytochrome. Oh, that's what you were referring to. Cytochrome enzymes like cytochrome P450. Mm-hmm. There are some enzymes in that group of enzymes that can dictate the first phase of detoxification. And I think that can be helpful to look at. We're always looking for that genotypic information of, do they have SNPs in this first phase of detoxification or second phase of detoxification, what that might mean. But we also have to keep in mind, what is the expression, what's going on in the patient's body, not only what are we seeing with the genotype, with their genetic information, but what are we seeing with the phenotype, which is their phenotypic result from that. What are we seeing in their biochemistry and their biomarkers, in other words? But yeah, I think that we were talking about vitamin D receptor and some of these other SNPs that a lot of these, when athletes are having issues with these, might manifest in things like joint pain and stuff that you're seeing day in and day out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That can definitely play a role in it, and I think we've talked about that aspect, and when we talked about hormones too, and the hormone episode, where if people have low amounts of testosterone, different things like that, they could also be experiencing joint pain, just like you mentioned in vitamin D as well. And obviously a lot of people know about vitamin D the link to bone health and everything, and preventing like osteoporosis, stuff like that. And when we're looking at joint health, which is the second aspect of structural integrity, we talked about the genomics, but the second piece to structural integrity is just like the physical, your physical structure as far as the like tissue health, joint health, all those different things, which is more what I specialize in. When we're looking at performance, that's obviously a huge component to it. And how someone's going to be able to perform is, how stable are their joints? I like to call it like bulletproof, like how bulletproof are their joints, and how susceptible are they, or ideally not to essentially going and being put through this like wear and tear pattern all the time. And so what are the different things that we can look at to prevent that wear and tear? And if it does occur, how do we go and improve their ability to heal down the road? And so, there is that physical aspect of that as well. And so much of it, from a structural standpoint, or a physical structural standpoint, so much of the health of that and how someone is able to heal and kind of respond very well to the treatments that I'm doing on them. A lot of it is dependent on these things that we've talked about in this series, with regards to, we're looking at performance optimization, sure, but a lot of this also goes into the aspects of healing. And if I'm going and treating someone's tendinosis or arthritis or ligament laxity, from that's causing their shoulder pain, knee pain, all those different things. All of these things that we've talked about in this series are super important to allowing and enabling their body to heal overall. Because at the end of the day, if we don't have these things in check, they're not going to heal very well. They're not going to recover from their injury very well, and ultimately their performance and their overall health will just suffer. And so, these are all very important to address before, or ideally address before they're injured. In my world, because I'm seeing someone that's injured, but when they are injured, it's just as important, because a lot of these, again, a lot of these are will help control their healing and be able to speed that aspect up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thankful that I have somebody like you to send people to when they haven't got these things right, and they're downstream from that. So you guys do great work over there.
I appreciate that. Thank you. We work hard at it, so that's good. I'm glad it's getting noticed. Awesome. Well, we touched a lot on the genomics of everything today, and now the one question I didn't ask when we started the episode that is people are probably wondering if they haven't figured it out already is, where are some of the things that we can go? We talked about these different SNPs. Most people probably thought of, I need to log into my 23andMe and go, look at what mine say. Is this something that's tested on 23andMe? If not, where can they get testing for this? And let's start with those questions from there.
Yeah, they should be part of the 23andMe report, along with thousands of other pieces of information in that report. So it should be in there. I typically will look at these through the lab that I consult for, which is Genova Diagnostics. So these are readily available through them. There are other laboratories that run them as well. So that's something that is pretty easy to do. Most of these genomics, it's a cheek swab with a cotton tipped applicator, and you send it off to the lab and you get all this data. So it's pretty easy to do. And the nice thing about genomic testing is you only have to do it once, because it doesn't change. So the SNPs themselves do not change. The genomics do not change. That's part of our DNA. But so that's one of the benefits. But we, like I said, we have to keep in mind, we can't make all decisions just based on one genomic result. We have to really look at the whole picture, look at the patient, look at what's in their lifestyle and their diet and how they're taking care of themselves. And really, that's where this information becomes really helpful as part of the overall context of the patient.
I think that's really important to emphasize, because so many people, genetics is this really interesting thing where the more we learn about it, the cooler it is. But then also the more people seem to be very tied to the results that they see mentally, and they forget about the aspect that we talked about earlier, where there is there is this aspect of gene expression, and it's basically a bunch of switches that can be turned on and off depending on, again, nutrition, exercise, a bunch of different environmental factors, stuff like that. As you mentioned, everything we discussed is more of a recipe, and then for those things that can't be switched on and off, how do we go and help improve your health by working around that, and kind of supporting different aspects, like we talked about with MTHFR, stuff like that. Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add to this particular episode, Dr. Warren?
No, I think that's it. I think that's a good introduction. And if people have questions, they're always welcome to reach out to me through my website. That's ca4sport.com. That's the CA, the letter 4, or the number 4, sport.com. So yeah, I'm more than happy to help any way I can.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, as we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, this was the finals episode of this series on secrets to performance optimization. I'm sure we'll have Dr. Warren on again in the future. Thank you all for the questions that you've submitted over the course of this particular series, kind of giving us an idea of what you'd like to learn about. And obviously, big thanks to Dr. Warren for being here and taking the time to record this podcast series with us. So, Dr. Warren, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Matt. It's always fun.
Perfect. Well, everyone, thank you for listening. On our next episode, we're going to be discussing weight training and how to do that effectively. As we talked about in one of the very first episodes we recorded, benefits of weight training, that, where we talk about how weight training helps with brain health, our physical health, obviously, and being able to help us age slowly or age gracefully, if you will. We had a lot of questions from that particular series of people who are wanting to learn how to weight train properly. And so we're going to be bringing on a special guest for that particular series. So that'll be our next series that we're going to be going into. Hope you enjoyed this particular series. And once again, thank you for listening.